everyone. Thanks for your patience as we're getting started and allowing for a few minutes for folks to join. We're really looking forward to this conversation today, and I'm super excited to be joined by Mel Blackmore as well. So I'm going to get a little bit into the agenda, and then I'll introduce myself and Pulsora, and then Mel will also introduce herself and Carbonology. Just as a reminder, also for this conversation, please feel free to add questions in the chat, and we will definitely make sure to spend some time on Q&A as well. All right, so for the next 45 minutes, we have quite a bit of content to cover. This is a very exciting topic. Things have been changing on by the week, by the day. And so we want to make sure we get to everything so that we can give you a comprehensive overview for these bills. So we're going to start a bit with introductions. Then we will speak about climate reporting landscape. I think I'm getting a little bit of an echo. And then we will talk about the specifics of these two bills. We'll speak on framework interoperability. So what it means is for you who may be reporting against other frameworks and standards, what does that mean when you think about compliance with these two bills? We'll talk a little bit about what that roadmap actually looks like. And then finally, we will get to some practical advice and demo of what it might look like on a platform like Pulsora and working with an assurance firm like Carbonology. And then, like I said, we'll definitely make some time for Q&A at the end. Great. So just to introduce myself and Pulsora before we kick off this content. So my name is Jessica Mathis, and I am a product manager at Pulsora. I lead our carbon product, and I've been working in the sustainability technology and AI space for the last 8 years. So really excited to be with you today. And then, as I mentioned, also, we're very fortunate to be joined by Mel Blackmore, founder and CEO of Blackmore's UK and Carbonology, who also has extensive experience in this space as well. So I will hand it off to Mel to introduce herself and also to share a bit about the reporting landscape that we see today.
Hi, thank you very much, Jessica, and welcome everybody to today's webinar. Mel Blackmore, I'm the founder and CEO of Carbonology. So Carbonology is an accredited verification body that verifies organisations' emissions against international standards like the GHG Protocol and ISO 14064, which is a requirement for various global mandatory reporting disclosures, which is the topic of discussion for today. So my background is about 20 years in sustainability standards, from ISO 14001 to a full range of different international standards. So I'm more than happy to answer any questions about that later on in the webinar. So I can provide a bit of context in terms of the regulatory landscape in terms of the greenhouse gas emissions verification reporting. Before we look at the regulatory requirements, which are all the nice green dots along the left-hand side, there is a lot of pressure actually that's coming not only externally but internally. So we've seen a progression of seniority in terms of responsibility and accountability when it comes to demonstrating an organisation's environmental footprint and their level of commitment to achieving net zero. So we're now seeing that within the C-suite, quite often there is a CSO, a Chief Sustainability Officer, and so we're finding that there's requests coming in for verification from them in order to be able to demonstrate to the leadership team and other key stakeholders exactly where they're at in terms of their journey in relation to net zero. But many organisations are also verifying their carbon footprint to meet other ESG rating providers' requirements, such as CDP or EcoVadis. But where we've seen a huge increase in terms of legislation and regulations are across ESG, both from an international context. Obviously, that's the topic that we'll be covering today, right through to, at a more local level, whether that be, for example, here in the UK, European, then UK, and then also even sector specific requirements for verification. So it's coming from all angles now. But the benefit of verification is that once you've calculated your emissions and reported your emissions and had them verified, you only need to do that once, because then that enables you to then comply with all of these different requirements, which I know Jessica will be coming on to shortly.
Awesome. And I think that lays a great foundation to get into, what are the requirements associated with these two bills. So there are two bills that are, primarily discussed as these California climate bills, SB 253 and SB 261. So I'm going to talk a bit about both of them and also some of the latest updates as well. So just for folks to know, these bills have not had their final version, codified through the legislature. They've had some changes, some working sessions and workshops this year to formally finalize certain fee structures and other eligibility criteria. But the main bulk of the, content for them is pending pending external kind of litigation, quite formalized and finalized. So that's what we want to spend the bulk of the time here today and emphasize that it's important to stay abreast of these things as they may have a little bit of change, as we've seen with some of the other, topics like the SEC bill and also CSRD in Europe as well. So let's get into what these two bills are. The first one is 253. 253 is what we think of as the, emissions reporting bill. So this is very focused on, reporting scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. In the first year, it's just focused on scope 1 and 2. And this has a revenue threshold. So it's very focused on, companies which are a bit larger who are doing at least 1 billion in annual revenue. And then they're also considered doing business in California. Doing business in California is a very specific legal definition, which essentially means that they have some, either high volume of sales in California, which is, I think, around a 750K threshold, or it is also having some sort of, business residency occupancy set up in California. So for example, if you're curious if this applies to you and your only association with California is, remote workers, then this would not necessarily apply to you. Similarly, also nonprofits are also exempt from both of these bills. But for 253 specifically, the guts of it is reporting on your scope 1 and 2 emissions. And there is a, due date that was announced, pushed back by 6 weeks in the last week. So now it is August 10th, 2026. And in the first year, it's just looking at scope 1 and 2. And then subsequent years, scope 3 is going to be part of it as well. And assurance plays a big part in this bill as well. So that is why we really want to have this conversation today and talk about what it means if this is going to be one of those things that's pushing your business to, either start, accounting for your emissions, or also maybe you've been doing some emissions quantification but haven't pursued a formal assurance program yet. And this is a great time to get started with that. The second bill is SB 261. This is what I would think of as the climate risk bill. And this is something that, as of last week, is actually on pause. This is going to be reviewed in January timeframe. So the current, expectation or requirement was that folks would, publish a external facing climate risk report to their website on January 1st. And then they have 6 months to share that, link to that external website with CARB, the California entity who is regulating these, the Air and Resources Board. That is now on pause, so most likely will be delayed until some later time in 2026. And this one has a slightly smaller threshold, with regards to revenue. So this is only looking at 500 million. So a greater number of companies are going to be subject to 261 compared to 253. But they both have the same kind of doing business in California legal definition that they need to follow as well. One other thing that I think is really important to emphasize with these two and ties into what Mel was just talking about is they're both very aligned to existing frameworks and standards. So California is not coming up with their own framework or standard for how to, quantify and describe, report these things. It's all pre-aligned with existing ones. So for 253, the measures that are reported need to be aligned with the GHG protocol, which is the internationally recognized main standard for quantifying your corporate GHG emissions, and many other regulations comply with that or are aligned with that. And then for 261, it's looking at any climate risk aligned reporting framework. So what that means is typically companies are thinking about either TCFD or ISSB S2. If you're already publishing a report that aligns to either or both of those, then that is great to also submit to CARB, and you don't need to change your process at all. You just need to submit that external link in the first 6 months of next year. So that's a brief kind of overview of what these two bills are. And I am guessing there will be questions on these, so really encourage you to put some of those in the chat, and then we'll make sure to spend some time on those later in the conversation. So now I'm also going to talk a bit about, what does this mean from a reporting perspective? So as Mel mentioned, the great thing about these is once you're assuring the data for one particular report, you can also you can leverage that pre-assured data for any of these reports. So if you're already going through a, assurance and review process or governance process around your TCFD report, then that is ready to go for your 261 compliance. Similarly, if you're already pursuing GHG external assurance with a firm like Carbonology, then you can leverage that assurance for any of your GHG reporting, including this California Bill 253. So something that is really important to think about, especially from a kind of platform perspective as well, like how can technology help and support this process, is really making sure to unify and standardize those data points that are going to be assured, and then be able to map those across these many different frameworks and standards, including the California ones, to make sure that you can get the most value out of that data, that you're spending a lot of time and effort making sure it is comprehensive, high quality, compliant, and auditable and assured. So with that, I'm going to pass it back to Mel to talk a bit more about the details of some of these reporting frameworks and what needs to be disclosed.
Great. So I'm going to be looking at covering from the point of view from a global reporting perspective. So obviously, I know that the main topic of conversation are the SB regulations, but I think it's important for organisations that are global, that will have services and products that they're offering internationally, that they're also aware of the disclosure requirements internationally. And also in terms of, what is the eligibility criteria for that? And also, what are the verification requirements? So as it stands at the moment, obviously there are some changes that Jessica mentioned just last week that we're just catching up on as of Monday morning today here in the UK. But I just wanted to give you an idea on the kind of the jurisdiction in terms of the main global reporting requirements. So we've got the EU CSRD. There is also the CS Triple D, which is all about due diligence. And there is also an EU Green Claims Directive as well, which very much focuses on verification. And for the first time, if an organisation is in breach of that EU directive, they could potentially be banned from marketing their products and services. So that's the first time that we've seen that in terms of the legislative requirements associated with environmental requirements. Then we've got the US SEC climate rules and the IFRS. So as you can see here, There is a slight variance in terms of what must be disclosed and where and when. So they have got slightly different time frames. And also there is some leniency when it comes to the reporting of scopes 1, 2, and 3 emissions. So typically the main requirements are scopes 1 and 2, and 3. And in terms of the level of assurance, that's also coming down the line as well. So yeah, as you can see, it is fairly similar actually, as we look at the different disclosing requirements. So in terms of the reporting criteria across the 3 main ones there, for Scope 3 disclosures, it's mandatory for the EU CSRD and also the Californian regs, but it's voluntary for the US SEC. In terms of the materiality test, only double materiality is required for the EU, financial materiality for the US, but there is no materiality test that's required for the Californian regs. Again, we're seeing the reporting already coming into place in the EU, even though there was something called the omnibus, which is pause on the regulations, that's still coming down the line. And in terms of the assurance requirements, so basically there are 2 levels of assurance. We've got limited level of assurance, which is a smaller sample of data, and it doesn't give full assurance on the greenhouse gas emissions, which is typically a requirement of the banks for getting access to sustainable linked loans or green bonds. So that's typically what a lot of the FTSE 100 have got, and also the S&P 500. However, those organisations that would like to demonstrate a greater confidence in relation to their greenhouse gas emissions assurance are going for reasonable levels of assurance. So reasonable level of assurance is where there is a greater sample and a greater level of confidence ultimately in terms of the assurance of the emissions. So for the EU CSRD, it's mandatory for limited at the moment, but that's moving over to reasonable. The US sector isn't any, and for Californian regs, that's going to be phased from limited to reasonable as well. In terms of the Scope 3 assurance timeline, for the EU, it's limited from year 1, US, it's none, and for California, that's limited by 2030. And in terms of safe harbour and liability, the EU CSRD has got assurance-based accountability, but in the US and California, we've got safe harbour, but that's going in a phased approach for California. And then finally, the verification requirements. So again, very similar here in that verification is required for the top 3, as you can see. And in terms of the standard, the GHG protocol is the most widely adopted standard alongside ISO 14064 Part 1 as well. So there are other standards, and there are actually about 20 or so different reporting standards, but there are actually 4 main ones. But the most popular 2 globally is the GHG protocol and ISO 14064. Okay, so as you can see, there's a phased approach here for verification from limited to reasonable in many cases.
Awesome. And first, we're going to launch a quick poll to get a sense of what some of those different frameworks you may be reporting to, so that we can get a good sense of that for the demo and Q&A. But while we're bringing that up, I also want to walk through what a checklist might look like to get ready for California compliance. And this is assuming that you are, not perhaps doing a formal process for some of these other regulations, which I'm sure some of you already are. So the first thing that's important to do for, compliance and getting ready for that audit ready data is to establish a data foundation. So what this means is taking your, relevant scope 1 and 2, especially for that first year data from wherever it may live today, could be in sometimes folks' emails, it could be like a mailed utility bill. It may exist on an energy management system or a procurement system, and really bringing all of that data together into a, good central place to work with. And then also, in addition to that, really validating and standardizing that data, those metrics to ensure that you have high quality data that's being brought in. The second item is to calculate emissions. So based on that data foundation, you want to make sure we're calculating emissions. And I see we're also closing the poll, so we'll see the results of that in a second. We want to make sure that we're calculating emissions GHG protocol aligned. So for scopes 1, 2, and 3. And something that's really important for this that Pulsora enables is providing comprehensive emission factor library out of the box, ready for you to use so that you can have the most relevant emission factor matched to your activity data as possible. So what does that mean? That means that you want to use an emission factor that is representing your data in terms of when an activity has happened and where it has happened, and maybe even what industry it has happened in, as closely and as accurately as possible. And that's going to ensure that those emissions details, those outputs of your emissions calculations, are as accurate as possible. Let's launch the results so that we can see. I'm curious, how many of you guys are already, have this foundation in place because you are already reporting to other frameworks. Okay, it looks like quite a few folks are already reporting to really GHG intensive frameworks like SBTI and CDP. And we also have folks that are reporting to some of the more 261 aligned frameworks as well, which is great. You guys already have a huge leg up when it comes to California compliance. And for those who, are not as, haven't done this for many years, that's okay too. And that's also why California has, these safe harbor provisions and things like this, because the purpose of these is to give some time, give a phased approach for folks to come up to speed, and then for this data to be used in a really valuable and transparent way, right? Which is to promote decarbonization and to make decisions based on the emissions of various entities. So let's get back a little bit to the compliance checklist. So we talked a bit about calculating emissions based on the data that you have, but the reality is you aren't always going to have all the primary data that you need. So a piece of that calculating emissions is going to be gap filling. It's going to be creating some estimations. And you can use a platform like Pulsora to have really comprehensive and complex estimations, or you can also, have a really streamlined estimation process that's a little bit more standardized and a little bit more kind of generalized. Either of those are fine. I think the most important thing with these first two steps is to make sure that you have a strong foundation, you have strong data governance, and that you're documenting your processes and your approach to all of these things. The next thing, when you have that foundation, you have that baseline for your emissions, now we can go and use that data to inform your key climate risks. And so getting started with your key climate risks, the first thing, if you aren't already, reporting risk against TCFD or IFRS S2 framework, is to really, I would say, choose one. I think the TCFD one is a great one to start with. It's pretty streamlined and simplified. There's about 11 metrics involved, and it's a really great place to get started if this is your first time doing a climate risk report. And the other big important thing about climate risk is this brings in a lot of need for processes around governance, for conversations, for aligning across various different entities and stakeholders in your companies to really make sure that those risks are aligned and agreed upon across many different groups. So climate risk reporting is a little bit less prescriptive than emissions calculation, but very important. And the process by which and the governance by which you are formalizing those risks and talking about those risks is really a big piece of it. And finally, once you have some of those risks identified and those gaps and mitigation levers, you have your emissions baseline, that is when you're going to transition into that verification and assurance process. So with a platform like Pulsora, you can have data controls, you can have validations, and you can really go into an audit with confidence. And this data and this transparency to everything that has happened to the data along the way is really a key piece of that. And with the assurance, as we've been speaking to, you can, assure that data once, and then you can use it across many frameworks. So this is a very valuable process that scales. And then finally, from a California perspective, right, we have that reporting step. So both of these bills have an annual reporting component. The 253, as mentioned, is going to be sort of towards the end of the summer in the first year, scope 1 and 2 data. And there's quite a bit of flexibility for how you report your scope 1 and 2 data as well. I highly recommend checking out the links in CARB's website, FAQ links for how to format this data and some of the suggested data points they recommend. But as long as it's GHG protocol aligned, you should be good to go. And then finally, providing a public link to your climate risk report in the summer as well. So publishing it in January and sharing it with CARB within 6 months later is the other key aspect for 261. I know we mentioned it's on pause, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you need to stop all efforts, because in all likelihood, it's probably going to continue on sometime later next year. Maybe not the January 1st, maybe it'll be delayed by a bit, but I think that it's still something that's quite important to, and a great time to get your ducks in a row to get prepared for it. So this is the compliance checklist. And with that, I want to share with you a quick demo of how a process like this might work in a platform like Pulsora. All right. So here we are in the Pulsora platform. And what I want to talk about today is kind of the journey from an individual utility bill all the way through to calculating of emissions, aggregating with other activity data, and then rolling that up into a report. So the first thing that we're going to do here is go to a task. This task is something that you can send to a facility manager or someone who may be collecting and may have access to those utility bills. So since we're talking about scope 2, a great example of that is electricity consumption. And let's say I am a facility manager and I have an electricity bill available, and I don't want to type all this data in. Something that I can do using Pulsora is I can actually upload the invoice directly, and then it can be scanned using AI for those values. So I don't even have to fill it out myself. This is something that's really valuable from a, preventing fat fingering perspective, but also making sure that that evidence file is tied to your activity, your electricity consumption, because that's going to help you down the line as well from an auditability perspective. So when folks are assuring your data, they can not only look at the values, but they can also confirm in the actual attached evidence that these values are indeed correct. So you can see in this example that we're able to pull those values from this utility bill and actually, have these values come directly from this PDF and even check against it. Like, for example, you can see this dollar amount was picked up for the spend. And we also have electricity consumption data later on. This is actually quite a long bill in terms of kilowatt hours. So if I save this, then where's this data going to go? So in Pulsora, we have dedicated workspaces for each of the scopes and categories associated with the GHG protocol, so you can focus on an individual piece of it at a time. So we were just looking at scope 2, so I'm going to bring up our scope 2 calculator and essentially quickly orient you here to all this data that we see. So in this space, what we have on the top is some summary data about my location and market-based emissions. We have some time data, so what period do these emissions represent? Because we are focused on calculating our emissions, our 2025 emissions for submission in 2026. And we also have some organization data, which means what part of this business am I looking at? For example, on Pulsora, you can also include upstream and downstream partners, customers, suppliers across your value chain to collect and manage data across them as well. But in this instance, we're focused on our corporate data. And then in the middle, we have our activities. So this is all the details that I am collecting, maybe through tasks like that facility manager task we just looked at, or maybe through a bulk upload, an API integration, or many other ways we can get that data ingested and available onto a platform. And for an individual record, we also have a detailed view of exactly all the detail and all the data that has been associated with it. Um, this includes the emission factor details, which specific emissions factors were provided, the GWP, and many other details that can be really valuable in helping kind of reconstruct some of that sample data that an auditor may want to look at and understand where it came from. And finally, we also have an evidence and audit log. So evidence is where you would see that attached file, if there's an attachment to it. And then audit log is where you would see anytime any user has added, edited, or modified the data in any way for this transaction, we always have traceability of it. So now we've collected a lot of different primary data, we've collated it in here, but maybe there's still some data gaps. So the next step is to use this calendarized data screen to help fill gaps. We've done a little bit of this work ahead of time, so you can see here that there's blue squares which represent estimated data, and then there's white which represent actuals. So this is a really helpful visual to understand where my estimates and my gaps lie and where my actual data is coming from, and also be able to compare and contrast different facilities over time to each other and look for trends. We also have the ability to handle things like if a facility didn't open, for example, until July, then it would be closed and no data is represented early and no estimations are also generated. And if I want to generate new estimations, or I would like to refresh some of the data, maybe I have new primary data that's been added, I can use these to go through that workflow. So now I have generated my data, I've filled my gaps, but I also need to report. And I also especially need to figure out how I want to report against my TCFD data points in this case. So now I'm going to go and navigate over to Catalogs. Catalogs is a repository of various different metrics and values that I want to use for reporting. And this is kind of like my master data management of all of my sustainability details. And so for this particular catalog, I have all of the different TCFD metrics and then have been grouped by topics. And I also want to take a look at an example and see how we can use Pulsora to help get started with filling out the metric, especially if this is my first time filling this out. So I'm just going to clear this quickly so we can start from scratch. But essentially, you can see this is the metric. We're looking at climate-related risks and opportunities. We also have the instructions directly brought in from the TCFD framework. And as a first step towards filling this out, if I'm someone who is not as familiar, this is my first time, and I'm not as comfortable starting with a blank sheet of paper as opposed to editing from a draft, I can use Write with Pulsora AI to generate that first draft of the metric to really help propel me to get started and feel comfortable with filling this out, or feel comfortable with getting a draft ready for review, like I said, across different stakeholder groups within my company. And here's the draft response that I'm seeing. So you can see here that there's some specific, and I can actually expand this a bit, there's a specific framework that's been provided, which is super helpful for me to think about climate-related and risks and opportunities and the impact, and also how I may want to talk about them to just get me started. And the other thing is that it's prompting me with these kind of fill in the blanks, almost like a Mad Libs of sorts, to make this custom, make this my own, and remind me that this is not the final version that I'm going to be using, but this is really using AI to help get me started with that metric specifically. And once I have this metric, once I have all of that data, and again, we had the GHG data as well that we had calculated and aggregated and brought into these metrics as well. And the final step is really to report. So I can use the reports module in Pulsora, which maps various frameworks and standards against my same set of metrics in my catalog. So this is kind of that one-to-many we've been talking about. Assure your data once, and then use those metrics across many different frameworks and reports. And in this case, we want to generate a climate risk report. So I'm going to click into this and I can choose even, for example, which period of the report I want to generate, which part of my organization. And then I can export this report. And when I want to view this report, it's going to have a full published history. So for example, I can see and download any previous version of this report that I've ever created. And I have a full traceability and snapshot to that. So now I'm going to open it up and show you this sample report. So this is a TCFD report. This is a Word report, although we can export in other formats as well. And then I can see in here specific templated aspects of this report, as well as the responses, which are coming directly from those metrics that I had just used AI to draft and then had a conversation with external teammates and confirmed these values. Now this is all collated in my report and it's ready to be sent to a PR communications and marketing team to really beautify and finalize and for publication on my public website. And then I can use that link to submit to CARB for my 261 compliance. So that's kind of the end-to-end version or vision of how you might use the Pulsora carbon management platform to make sure that you are compliant against these two California climate bills. And with that, I'm going to pass it back off to Mel to share some top tips and a bit more on the process on the assurance side.
Great, thank you, Jessica. So, yeah, organisations are either going to be self-reporting and marking their own homework, which is the majority of organisations at the moment, versus independent verification. So I'm just going to explain the difference between both of those options. So for self-reporting, unfortunately, there is a potential for bias here, whether that's done intentionally or unintentionally. So there is a possibility of underreporting emissions to help to potentially avoid penalties or negative publicity. Now, I'm sure that in the vast majority of cases, this doesn't happen, but that could happen either intentionally or unintentionally because nobody else is checking it. So, which leads me on to the next point. There is a lack of transparency in relation to the data that's been calculated, including the methodology, for example. And there may also be a situation where an organisation is literally making it up as they're going along. They're not actually using an international framework of best practice, like the Greenhouse Gas Protocol or ISO 14064. So they may be missing key points when it comes to identifying their scope and boundaries, their quantification methodology, and reporting. And then, of course, that can lead to inconsistencies. So if they haven't got that framework, if they haven't got that benchmark, there could be a significant difference in the reporting year on year. And especially if there are different people that are coming into the organisation that are involved in the calculations, if they haven't got that framework in order to be able to report against and also to have it independently checked. So that doesn't actually give you any type of guarantee that the data is accurate. So the knock-on effect of that not only means that you could be liable for, false claims, but you could be in breach of any mandatory reporting disclosure requirements as well. So in terms of the independent verification route, what does that mean? So there we go. Okay, so there are some core principles within ISO 14064, which is all about accuracy, reliability, transparency. And this just brings a higher level of assurance that reported emissions data is accurate and actually complete. You have to be very upfront and honest about the methodology that's used and the fact that there is an independent accredited third party coming in to validate your claims brings that added credibility and confidence to key stakeholders, especially if we're looking at investors, for example. So they would have typically been looking at least 3 years worth of audited financial reports, and now they're looking at several years of carbon accounting reports that have been independently checked as well. So they're treating it the same as financial reporting. That's how serious it's been taken in terms of ESG data. I guess one of the other aspects as well is that it helps to identify the inaccuracies of data, which brings me on to this slide, actually. That's good timing, Jessica, thank you. So this could be as a result of not using the correct conversion factor for a particular country, or in some cases, some countries will have state or region specific factors. And so, if you're dealing with the calculation of several countries, this could easily be calculated incorrectly as a result of that. And at the end of the day, we're only human as well. So, the input of the data can be incorrect. In some cases, we don't actually find that there's a GHG report at all. And I think one of the main challenges really is these spreadsheet monsters that we come across sometimes, which is why it's an absolute joy and a pleasure to audit clients that are using Pulsara software. And I'm slightly biased there, but it is true. It makes life so much easier from an audit perspective, having everything at your fingertips, because it just means that there is less room for error at the end of the day. So I'm just going to quickly walk you through the verification process and what's involved. And the first stage is to complete a readiness review. We've got a QR code at the end, so you can go in and basically check your readiness for verification in terms of the scope and boundaries and reporting data that you may have available for a specific reporting period. That then will help to deduce whether you're ready for verification or not. If you're not, then there are a number of options there to complete training, to look at working with Pulsara, for example, to be able to capture all the relevant information so you can report on it. And then when you are ready for verification, there's a pre-verification process, which is an informal meeting that goes through the scope and boundaries, the data that's required, etc. And then we go into the stage 1 and stage 2 verification audits, which I'll just expand on in a little bit more detail on the next slide. So in terms of that initial pre-verification stage, it's important that we understand the level of assurance. So I mentioned earlier whether limited or reasonable is going to be the right option for you. And that determines the number of days of the audit and the evidence that is required and who's going to be involved in your project team for submitting that information. We then move on to stage 1, which is looking for the key documents that we need in order to be able to validate your claims. So these are things like your inventory and the intended use of that, the significance policy, and other key documents like the dissemination policy. During the stage 1, we also cover the scope 1 and 2 emissions, including the quantification methodology, any estimates and assumptions, the factors that you're using, and also any uncertainty approaches, plus the exclusions and justifications. Again, this is all about being completely transparent. And then finally, we move on to stage 2, where we get into the scope 3 emissions. So this is where we find it does take a bit longer, because this can be quite a challenging area for a lot of organisations in getting accurate information from their supply chain. Okay, actually, one of the questions I'd like to ask, actually, I think we have a poll for this, is whether you ask for verified data from your supply chain. I think we may have a poll that we have available to ask that question. So do you ask for verified data from your supply chain? Because if you did, this would make life so much easier when it comes to calculating and reporting on your scope 3 emissions. But I'll let you finish completing that whilst I just explain about the last part of the process. So stage 2 also covers any reduction initiatives and forecasts as well. And we can provide guidance in this particular area about those forecasts in relation to your current GHG inventory. Okay. And then finally, there is a peer review that's completed independently at Carbonology. A report is produced in order to be able to document the verification opinion statement, and there is also a verification certificate that's issued. And finally, a verification mark, which can be used on marketing collateral, like websites, for example, but not on products, because this isn't verification of products, it's for the organisation's GHG emissions. So have we had everybody complete that poll now? Should we just take a look at the results there? Okay, oh, that's interesting. So less than a quarter are, but it's looking quite promising that over half, 63%, are saying no, but we plan to start doing that. And no, we don't have any plans to do so in the future. That's about a quarter as well. So thanks very much for your feedback on that. That's really interesting. Great. Okay. Well, I think if we just go on to the next slide, I think that's a wrap for now. I think we have got that verification readiness review QR code. If you'd like to scan that, that will give you your free readiness review, so you can see exactly where you're at in terms of being ready for a verification. Okay, so yeah, thank you very much for listening, and I believe we may have a couple of questions.
Yes. Okay, maybe I'll start with a question for you, Mel. So, one question is, how do we know if our greenhouse gas data is ready for third-party assurance required for 253?
Uh, well, in terms of whether it's ready, you need to obviously go through the scopes 1, 2, and 3 and be able to be confident in the quantification of the reporting. But if you're using software like Pulsara, for example, you'll be able to clearly see from the reports and the outputs that is produced and whether that's ready or not. But ultimately, you're looking for defined reporting period, a 12-month reporting period, whether that's a calendar year or tying in with your financial year. That's the kind of data that we're looking for. And some organisations decide to complete 2 reporting periods, even 3 in some cases, if they're going back in time.
Awesome. Okay, I'm seeing some additional questions about 253 and reporting templates. So folks are asking, is there a CARB reporting template for California 253? So for 253, there is no official no guideline aside from being aligned to the GHG protocol. However, if you are, starting out and looking for something to follow, they have released a sample template, an Excel file, which has several specific fields that you can fill out, such as boundary-related details, emissions factors details, and of course, actual scope 1 and 2 and 3 emissions numbers as well. So feel free to check that out on CARB's website. Maybe we'll send that out in one of the follow-up emails along with the webinar recording so you can look at the specific details. But again, I think it's meant to be much more of a starting point. It's not a specific framework that's going to be, reviewed against in any way.
I think one of the interesting things I found doing my research, so I'm currently doing a master's of research in relation to the drivers and impact of greenhouse gas emissions reporting and disclosures. And it's really interesting to see, both in terms of the primary and the secondary research, that it seems to be the markets that are actually driving the demand for reporting, disclosures and verification, which was quite a surprise when I first started doing the research 2 years ago. I was fully expecting it to be driven by regulations But it's really interesting to see that organisations aren't it's actually swaying towards the markets. And one of the key reasons for that is for financial reasons, actually. So more often than not, organisations get access, unlocks access to sustainable finance through sustainable linked loans, green bonds, investor opportunities as well. Plus all the ESG rating programs, like CDP and EcoVadis. So yeah, the vast majority are actually reporting voluntarily. So I know that obviously there's been a pause on the regulations at the moment, but that doesn't seem to be stopping people from actually doing the reporting and the disclosures, because at the end of the day, we need to get to net zero. We need to be able to demonstrate evidence of that. And there is a big credibility gap in terms of what organisations are claiming and what they're actually doing in terms of their results. So it seems to be the markets that are pushing for proof.
Mm, yeah, definitely. And I think even in the earlier poll, that was reflected with so many people saying that their companies are reporting against voluntary standards like SBTI as well.
Yes, it ties in with that, doesn't it? Yes, yeah, yeah, yeah. And it's really interesting, the increase in a company value, if they are um, demonstrating commitments either through SBTIs. That the figures show that there was a study over 8 years of the S&P 500. It identified that those organisations that committed to reducing their carbon emissions increased their company valuation by 4%. But for those that actually put their money where the mouth was and actually got independent verification, the company valuation increased by 10%. That is
Wow.
really quite significant. So, yeah, and that was over an 8 year period.
Wow. That's interesting.
Mm.
Well, maybe
I
I'll
think it's
close with
367 companies out of the 500 that actually verified, and that they were the ones that had the increase in company valuation. So again, I know that obviously we're talking about regulation here today, and obviously there has been a bit of a setback over the last week with the Californian regs. However, I think it is just temporary. It's only going to be a matter of time.
definitely. And also the setback doesn't apply to 253. So in terms of your
Mm.
emissions accounting, scope one and two are still expected to be completed by August 10th of 2026. I want to answer one last of these questions. Okay, so one last question with regards to 253. Question is, does SB 253 require reporting for all scope one, two, and three um, scopes? So in the first year, you are only required to submit data regarding scope one and two. And then in subsequent years, starting in 2027, on your 2026 data, be asked to submit data as well on scope three. However, there's evolving guidance with regards to which of the scope three categories are expected to be included and the materiality process or documentation of the decision making with regards to which of those categories will be included. So that will be something interesting to keep an eye out for the next kind of CARB quarterly meeting. I think they said they would meet in the spring to discuss a little bit more on that. And so it'll be interesting to see how that evolves as well. So with that, I think we have spent quite a bit of time going over some extra questions and topics, but really wanted to thank everyone for being here and especially, Mel, for joining us and sharing all of this wisdom on the assurance process as well. I think it was really valuable and interesting to hear. So thank you all so much, and we'll be sharing the recording and some follow-up resources via email. Have a great day.